Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we cut through the noise to bring you clarity on the world's most complex issues. Today we're plunging into a story that, well, it really just erupted in Europe, and it reveals some deep cracks in the facade of unity. Imagine this. Just days ago, August 31st, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, she publicly floated the idea of fairly precise plans for EU troops in Ukraine, envisioning them as a security guarantee, after a potential peace deal. But the very next day, the response from Germany, immediate and fierce. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius shot back, calling her remarks, and I quote, totally wrong. He pointedly stated that the EU Commission has no competence or authority whatsoever regarding the deployment of troops. Full stop. He insisted that, such sensitive military discussions should never happen publicly before negotiations. And if that wasn't clear enough, the next day, September 2nd, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz echoed this dismissal.
He made it absolutely clear there were no such concrete plans, at least not in Germany, and stressed his considerable reservations about sending German soldiers without national parliamentary approval. Now, this wasn't just a minor spat. It exposed a gaping rift right at the heart of European security policy. It really challenges the EU's military authority and that deeply guarded national sovereignty. And as part of a wider picture, while you have a coalition of the willing, think France, the UK, the Baltics, Belgium, they might be open to such deployments. But many other EU countries, including Germany, Hungary, Poland, Italy, the Netherlands, they remain skeptical or even outright opposed. And even former U.S. President Donald Trump has offered air support, but explicitly ruled out American ground troops. That leaves Europe, well, grappling with its own defenses. So European unity is truly facing a new test as the top EU officials' military ambitions clash head-on with national sovereignty, revealing deep fault lines in how Europe approaches defense.
Today we're unraveling the complex legal and political constraints on the European Union's military action, Germany's transformative yet often criticized Zeitenwende policy, and these critical tensions surrounding recent proposals for troop deployment to Ukraine. We've distilled insights from official statements, detailed analyses, various reports, all to help you cut through the noise. Our mission: to ensure you understand the intricate dynamics of European security, Germany's pivotal but challenged role, and what these developments truly mean for collective action versus national sovereignty. Okay, let's unpack this recent firestorm then. Ursula von der Leyen's comments about fairly precise plans for EU troops in post-war Ukraine, August 31st. They sparked immediate outrage. What was it about those specific words that made them so explosive? Why did Germany react so strongly so quickly?
Well, what's really striking here is the sheer speed and the directness of the German backlash. Von der Leyen's statement, given to the Financial Times, it wasn't just a casual suggestion. It implied a level of planning that, from Germany's viewpoint, completely overstepped the European Commission's authority. Defense Minister Pistorius' swift, sharp rebuke, calling her remarks totally wrong, it underscored a really fundamental principle. The Commission, which is a supranational body, essentially the EU's executive arm, and has absolutely no business, no authority in deploying troops. These are, as he argued, intensely sensitive military matters. They should be discussed behind closed doors, not, casually revealed to the press. And then Chancellor Merz just hammered this point home, dismissing any idea of concrete plans, at least not in Germany,
right,
and reiterating that national parliamentary approval, it isn't just a nice to have. It's a non-negotiable constitutional requirement for sending German soldiers abroad. He also voices considerable reservations. So this public disagreement, it's not just political theater. It really exposes a fundamental, persistent tension between what some see as the EU institutions' ambition for greater power and the tightly guarded sovereignty of member states, particularly Germany, when it comes to defense. It really brings up the core question. Who truly calls the shots on matters of war and peace in Europe?
So it's not just a minor disagreement. It's really about a foundational issue, isn't it? Who holds the ultimate power over military action? And this division, it isn't unique to Germany, right? We're seeing other European nations kind of falling into different camps on this.
Absolutely. This isn't just a German internal debate. It clearly reveals a split right across Europe. On one side, you've got this coalition of the willing. Countries like France, the UK, the Baltic states, Belgium, they're generally more open to the idea of such deployments. They often see the need for a stronger, maybe more autonomous European defense capability. But then there's the other side, showing strong skepticism, sometimes outright opposition, and that group includes Germany, Hungary, Poland, Italy, the Netherlands. This kind of division makes any unanimous EU military action incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible. And adding another layer to this complexity, former U.S. President Trump indicating air support, yes, but explicitly ruling out American ground troops. That puts even more pressure back on Europe to find its own security solutions, which, in turn, further exposes these internal fault lines.
Okay, that brings us to a really critical question. Beyond the political drama, why is the idea of EU troop deployment so contentious, particularly from a legal and political standpoint? What are the actual hurdles the EU faces when trying to act militarily as a bloc?
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the challenges are deeply embedded in the EU's very structure, its DNA, you could say. The EU's legal framework for making military decisions is fundamentally intergovernmental. What that means is primary authority rests with the individual member states, not with supranational bodies like the European Commission, which sort of acts more like a central government. Under the Common Security and Defense Policy, the CSDP, that's the EU's framework for defense matters, the European Commission genuinely has, quote, no authority or competence whatsoever regarding troop deployment. That power resides firmly with the Council of the EU, which represents the member states. And the Political and Security Committee, the PSC, manages the strategic direction. There are two major legal constraints that effectively hobble any swift EU military action. First, and maybe most crucially, is the principle of unanimity. Article 31 of the EU Treaty mandates that any council decision with military or defense implications must be adopted unanimously. Now, this isn't just bureaucratic red tape. You could argue it's almost a design flaw for collective action. I mean, imagine trying to make a critical, time-sensitive military decision when any one of 27 nations can just hit the veto button. It means the EU is, by its very legal structure, almost designed to struggle with decisive military action, a reality often overlooked in the grand rhetoric about common European defense. Second, national parliaments like Germany's Bundestag usually have constitutional authority to approve the foreign deployment of armed forces, and these national approvals, they can't be bypassed by EU decisions. And finally, there's the money. The EU budget cannot be used for operational military spending. Those costs are borne directly by the participating member states, as stipulated by Article 412 of the EU Treaty. So not only do you need everyone to agree, but then individual countries have to pony up the cash.
Right. So even if they could somehow overcome the legal hurdles, the politics must be a nightmare. Divergent interests, public opinion. What does that actually look like on the ground? And what are the practical realities of trying to deploy such a force anyway?
That definitely raises an important question about political will, but also capacity. Achieving that unanimity is incredibly challenging precisely because member states often have very different security interests and threat perceptions. What's a top priority for, say, a Baltic state right on the border with Russia might be viewed very differently by a country further west. The debate over Ukraine deployment perfectly illustrates this split. Public opinion is also a huge factor. It leads to what some call democratic deficit concerns, basically. Decisions made without enough democratic oversight can undermine the EU's legitimacy. For instance, there was a recent survey, August 2025. It showed Germans were nearly evenly split on a peacekeeping force. Around half were in favor, but almost as many opposed, especially in eastern Germany. And then there are the hard, practical military realities. Experts estimate that just securing a ceasefire line in Ukraine would require at least 100,000 troops. That's a staggering number. It would overwhelm most European armies. A more realistic maximum deployment, if you look at European capacities, would probably be somewhere between 20,000 to 30,000 troops. So this highlights a pretty significant gap between the political ambition to act and the actual military capacity to deliver.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. We've established the EU's hands are largely tied by their own rules, its own member state divisions. But against this backdrop of, well, European hesitancy, one major player, Germany, has declared this profound transformation, Zeitenwende. What exactly is this turning point? And is this really as revolutionary as it sounds?
Zeitenwende, yeah, it translates to turning point or change of eras. It was Chancellor Olaf Scholz's bombshell announcement back in 2022, right after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It marked a profound, truly historic shift in German foreign and security policy, a sharp break with its post-Cold War strategic culture, which was all about military restraint. At its core, it's about Germany rearming and re-engaging with military power in a way it just hasn't done in decades. They created this massive 100 billion special fund to modernize the Bundeswehr, that's Germany's armed forces. The goal was to finally meet NATO's target of spending 2% of GDP on defense. Now, this wasn't just about spending more money. It was Germany explicitly declaring its ambition for a leading military role in Europe, effectively positioning itself as a framework nation within NATO, meaning it would provide the backbone for joint operations. And a very tangible commitment to this shift is the permanent deployment of a German combat brigade to Lithuania. That's expected to be fully operational by 2027.
And their support for Ukraine has been a complete reversal, hasn't it? Decades of long-standing policy just overturned, but I guess some might say took them long enough, right?
Indeed. While it is a historic reversal, that exact sentiment, too little, too late, is a key criticism you hear, particularly from Germany's Eastern European neighbors. Germany did become the second largest provider of military aid to Ukraine right after the United States, which is a significant departure from its longstanding policy of not sending weapons into active conflict zones. They've provided crucial weapon systems, things like the Flak Panzer Leopard anti-aircraft systems, PZH-2000 artillery, Leopard 2 battle tanks, and critically, under Chancellor Friedrich Merz back in May 2025, all those range-based limitations on German weaponry delivered to Ukraine were removed. That allowed for long-range attacks on Russian soil, which shows a clear escalation in commitment, you have to say.
So Zeitenwende sounds like a major step forward, especially on Ukraine support. But as you mentioned, it's not without its critics. What are the main criticisms and maybe the misaligned expectations surrounding this policy, especially from Germany's Eastern European allies? Are they convinced this is real?
That's a crucial point, because while Germany sees this as a radical departure from its past, many in Central and Eastern Europe still view it with, well, deep skepticism. Remember that early infamous offer? Just 5,000 helmets to Ukraine. That wasn't just a PR blunder. It became a symbol, almost a meme really, of Germany's perceived reluctance. It's foot-dragging. It sparked widespread ridicule and definitely deepened mistrust from allies who were literally on the front lines. And the long debates over whether to supply powerful weapons like the Taurus missiles, that also fueled this perception of hesitation. So countries like Poland and the Baltic states, they consistently view Germany's pivot as too slow and tentative. There's often a belief there that Berlin initially prioritized its own economic interests, particularly its deep ties with Russia, over regional security, and that this resulted in only incremental military aid. This perception is really deeply shaped by historical memory. Things like the legacy of Ostpolitik Germany's Cold War policy of engagement with the Eastern Bloc, and a perceived history of appeasing authoritarian regimes. These are countries, remember, on the front line of potential Russian conflict. Their historical context makes them inherently more wary. So while Germany genuinely sees its policy shift as radical, many in Central and Eastern Europe see it as, frankly, insufficient to meet the current geopolitical reality. It highlights a persistent gap in understanding. And this also leads to friction with allies. For example, Germany-led initiatives like the European Sky Shield Initiative, ESII, it's backed by over 20 nations, but it faced criticism and refusal to join from key NATO members like France and Poland. They worried it favored non-EU, specifically German, interests.
Right. That's a lot of external friction, those misaligned expectations.
Right.
But what about the internal constraints? What domestic divisions, what economic realities within Germany are impacting its ability to act decisively? And how does that spill over to its EU neighbors?
This really raises an important question about the long-term viability of these policies, not just for Germany, but for the wider EU. A major domestic hurdle is simply funding. How do they fund defense spending once that initial 100 billion special fund for the Bundeswehr runs out? Because it will run out. Debates over Germany's constitutionally mandated debt brake, that's a strict rule limiting new government borrowing, they deeply divide the government. Though Friedrich Merz did hint back in November 2024 that a reform might be possible. Now, this isn't just a domestic fiscal headache for Berlin. It directly impacts Germany's capacity to contribute to broader EU defense initiatives. It could potentially leave other European nations wondering just how serious Germany truly is about its proclaimed leadership role. And beyond funding, you have bureaucratic obstacles, a defense industry still kind of stuck in peacetime mode. All this has significantly slowed the actual modernization of the Bundeswehr. And these domestic challenges, they definitely have wider European implications. For example, Germany's rapid entry into the liquefied natural gas or LNG market after cutting off Russian gas, well, it drove up global gas prices. And that disproportionately impacted smaller European economies that were already struggling. Similarly, Germany's huge $200 billion energy relief package back in 2022, that raised concerns about competitive imbalances within the EU single market, mainly because it was done with very little consultation with partners. Also, Germany's, let's say, reluctance to fully address its economic dependencies on China, allowing Chinese investment in Hamburg port, Huawei's ongoing role in 5G that raises alarm bells in closely tied countries like Lithuania and the Czech Republic. They fear being dragged into a potentially problematic relationship. Some critics observe what they call a mentality problem, where Germany's first reflex is always, what can Germany do? It's never, what can we do in the European Union? That highlights a persistent challenge for real European cohesion.
So considering all these internal and external pressures, how sustainable is Zeitenwende in the long term? And how is public opinion shaping its future, especially with the political shifts happening in Germany?
Well, look, Russia's aggression has fundamentally altered Europe's security landscape. A return to the pre-war policies seems impossible. But
That said, significant concerns definitely remain about sustaining Zeitenwende long term. Due to both political and economic challenges, that $100 billion fund, it simply won't be enough. Experts project an annual shortfall of at least $25 to $30 billion just to meet the 2% GDP defense target after the fund is exhausted. And the current government is deeply divided on how to bridge that gap. Do they cut social welfare, raise taxes, try to ease the debt brake? Each option comes with huge political costs. Societal cohesion is another really critical factor here. You have a large majority, over 3/4 of Germans, who view Russia as a military threat, and 86% express deep distrust in Putin's government. So the threat perception is there. However, there's a disconnect. Only about 38% of Germans actually want their country more actively engaged in international crises. A significant majority, around 71%, oppose Germany taking an active military leadership role. They prefer a more restrained diplomatic approach. Public opinion is also split right down the middle on military aid to Ukraine. About 44% support stepping up assistance, while 47% disagree. And even on the end goal of the war, Germans are divided. Roughly 41% believe the West should pressure Ukraine to accept territorial losses to end the war, but an equal 41% favor helping Ukraine recapture all Russian-held territories, including Crimea. It's really split.
And the political landscape in Germany itself is shifting rapidly, isn't it? That must complicate things even further for any kind of unified European action.
Exactly. Germany's political landscape is described as being in flux, with increasing fragmentation. Following Olaf Scholz losing that vote of confidence in December 2024 and the snap election in February 2025, Friedrich Merz of the center-right CDU-CSU is the clear frontrunner for chancellor. Now, this is a crucial development because you have a potential bloc of parties like the AfD, the new BSW party, the Left Party, who are generally Eurosceptic and oppose the current German security policy. Collectively, they could hold well over 30% of parliamentary seats after the 2025 election. This potential bloc could significantly constrain a future government's ability to act decisively on EU affairs, things like treaty changes or new joint financing initiatives. As a potential chancellor without prior executive experience at the federal level, Merz might initially focus more on domestic politics. His fiscally conservative policies could please some EU members who advocate for financial prudence, but they could also complicate joint financing initiatives that other EU nations might feel are necessary. His chancellorship would also likely further shift the political balance within the European Council towards the center-right.
Wow. Okay. This exploration has truly laid bare the intricate dynamics at play here. So wrapping this up, what does this all really mean for you, the listener? Well, first, the EU faces these deep-seated legal and political challenges for any military action, especially troop deployment. It requires unanimous consent, respects member states' national sovereignty often, it seems, to the point of paralysis. Second, Germany's Zeitenwende. Yes, it's a historic shift in defense spending and support for Ukraine. Yet it's widely criticized, particularly by Eastern European allies, for being too slow, too hesitant. This creates significant misalignments and undermines trust. Third, those domestic divisions over defense funding, the bureaucratic hurdles, a perceived Germany-first economic approach. They continue to constrain Germany's ability to act decisively and unify Europe, even as it tries to step into a leadership role. And finally, that recent public clash over potential EU troop plans. It just underscores this ongoing tension between the ambitions of EU institutions and the closely guarded defense autonomy of member states, all complicated by a fragmented German political landscape and that deeply divided public opinion we discussed. So here's a provocative thought for you to consider. Considering these persistent internal divisions within the EU and within Germany, alongside the shifting political landscapes and that fragmented public opinion, can Europe truly forge a cohesive and decisive security strategy in what's clearly an increasingly unstable world? Or will national interests and domestic constraints inevitably continue to fragment any attempts at real collective action?